Well, with that kind of introduction, I'm going to just say goodbye and thank you everybody for coming. No, I am, first of all, I would like to thank Paul and Catherine Loudon and Michael for inviting me. I have to tell you, as I look out, and I know probably about a third of you because I've been retired since 2010, but as I look out, there's no greater honor to anybody that's been in this career for 45 years to be asked to speak to young administrators, leaders in education, so I really appreciate that honor. And I want to tell you that I appreciate you. I know how challenging it is to be a school leader. Education is becoming more complex. Your challenges are, they're always greater, but I know all of you go home at night and you wonder and you worry whether you've served a child the best way you can or whether you've served a group of children the best way you can. And I want to appreciate, give yourselves a hand. I went to the eye doctor the other day and said I need better far vision, and he said, why? And I said, well, is it a life process? Is there something that's holding you back? And I said, yeah, I can't see the ESPN scoreline anymore. So he got me better glasses, and that's going to really help me in this presentation because I can see the PowerPoint. My mission in this workshop, you're the leaders of the school, and I'm going to share ideas that involve intensive care children, recognizing that you have a tremendous influence on your teachers, the frontline individuals. You have a tremendous influence on families, and so I see this as a great opportunity to affect not only you, but a lot of kids in a lot of schools. My topic is intensive care children. I'll get into that in more depth, but basically it's children that need extra care, and we'll further define that as we go along. Throughout my presentation, because it is a little long, I'm going to be coming back to the idea that intensive care children are children that at this time in their lives need extra care. Many of them do have some discipline problems, and so they need effective discipline and they need extra support. And as you can see, as Kim so beautifully explained to us, and I think one of the greatest things about Kim's presentation is we learn better when we are in contact with our emotions, and Kim did a wonderful job telling her story and helping us to emotionally understand the ideas, try to understand the ideas she was presenting. I want to just start off, why did I pick the word intensive care? It's not original to me. But when you think about a hospital, and you go to a hospital, there are different wings, but there's usually one wing that is probably the most serious wing in the hospital, and those are the individuals that need intensive care. And I think of that with some of our students in our school, where they're at this point in their life, they need extra care to survive. If we don't give them that extra care, they may not survive very well in our schools. These kids, I do not like the label of ADD, OCD, the labels we give these kids. I think those should be reserved for clinical psychologists. Preferably, I think, let's talk about them as intensive care kids, where right now, because of their life circumstances, they need extra care. I think that's a really good way of looking at these kids. Ultimately with them, I think what we all want, but we lose sight of this sometimes, is we want these kids to become their own caretakers someday. That if we give them the intensive care they need now, someday they will be able to take care of themselves better. I want to give you a little metaphor that helps me think about these kids. I walk through Oxbow Park 2 or 3 times a week, and as I leave the park and I go up the railroad tracks, there in the gravel is a weed that I see every year. Every June that weed is there. It's prickly, it's in very harsh soil, but in June that weed has the most beautiful bloom you could ever see. It's a wildflower. And I think of our intensive care kids from that standpoint, that they all have a bloom, and that some way, one way or another, we should help them to try to find that bloom. Who are these IC children in your school? First of all, as I go through this presentation, I would like each and every one of you to think of your predominant IC child in your building. Who is the child that you either worry about the most, you spend the most time with? Who is this child? And if you will just take about 10 seconds right now, because I know you got a lot of IC children in your buildings. Think right now about one kid who you're going to think about as we go through this presentation. Take about 10 seconds. Okay, I think the list of IC children that we deal with in the schools, that my list is not exhaustive, and you can add many other kids. But I think often they're the angry child who's acting out. They're the ones we see quite a bit in our buildings. Sometimes they're the children that are acting in. They don't have any hope. They don't feel very good about themselves. Sometimes they do some self-injurious behaviors. There's certainly, oftentimes it's children with disabilities. Not all children with disabilities are IC children, but many of them are, because they go to school every day for 6 hours and they're not very good at a lot of things they're asked to do at school. And that's a tough feature for our egos to absorb. There are also trauma children, and Kim just went into that subject so well. And I think we know with trauma children, it could be a child the night before who was beaten by their parents. It could also be a child who continually watches his father beat his mother over time. So there's many different types of kids experiencing trauma. And there's no one intervention, nor should there be a massive intervention. I think the intervention that Kim talked about that really resounded in my my mind, was care. Care and listening. So we have these kids in our school. And then the next question becomes, why does it matter that we help them? And I kind of go at that point, I kind of hit my head like a lot of these athletes do. I could put myself on my hand on my heart and I say, educators lead with their hearts. You didn't go in this profession to become rich. I don't think you did you? You didn't go in this profession to be statistical analysts. You went in to help kids. And there are no kids in our schools that need more help than our intensive care kids. I also kind of come back sometimes to the Pareto principle. And that principle is simply that in many functions of our society, 80% of our energy and resources are consumed by 20% of the population. And when you think about your buildings, there's some truth to that. And now the statistics could change certainly. But and my thinking with intensive care children is if we can give them the care they need and help them to become their own caretakers, maybe those percentages could change. That society will not have to be spending the massive doses of resources on your particular IC kid because in school he learned to take care of himself, or she learned, and society no longer has to do that. Last thing, which is kind of an interesting concept, when I see that wildflower on the railroad tracks, I look out and I see the harsh soil and the fact there are no other plants there, and I think, you know, many of our intensive care kids are pretty darn resilient. That what we're talking about is, let's not just get these kids out of the intensive care wing. They can become champions. because they've developed that resilience and they've had hardships and they've overcome that. So I like with intensive care kids, I think to go beyond. Now think of that kid you're thinking of right now. That kid may someday be a champion. At the end of my presentation, I'm going to talk about a champion. I'm going to talk about one real quickly right now. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Wilma Rudolph. I'm going to say about half of you. She's my intensive care champion because she had so many obstacles. Wilma Rudolph was born in Tennessee. She was one of 19 brothers and sisters in a poor family. She was premature. By the time she was 7, she developed polio. And she needed medical care, but she couldn't get it in her town because she was black. And there were a lot of doctors that were not willing to serve her, or hospitals. So her mother scraped up the money from her church group and took her to Nashville, where she survived the fever that goes with polio, but she came home with braces. When she tried to go to school, she was not allowed to go to school. Some of us at times complain a little about some of the special education requirements we have, but sometimes I think we should look back and be thankful, because nowadays Wilma Rudolph would be very welcome in school. We have gone further than any country in the world in terms of helping children with physical disabilities to get their education. Give yourselves a hand, because that's not just special ed, that's everybody. She did her physical therapy, her legs became stronger to the point at age 12 she was able to throw away her braces, and she was able to walk into her church, and she received a standing ovation. And whenever I talk right now about what we need to do at school, we should always remember we need to do the same things in the community. We need to support these kids. She went on to high school, and this is a tall, lanky, black young lady with pretty strong legs. She'd been doing physical therapy her entire life. She had 2 teachers in her memoirs that gave her all the extra support she needed. And that's kind of where the main message is today, extra support and care, and encouraged her to go to college. She also had a coach who recognized that she was not only a good basketball player, this gal could run. Wilma Rudolph went to Middle Tennessee State, eventually became a national track star. In 1960, Wilma Rudolph went to the Rome Olympics, and she was the first woman from the United States to ever win 3 gold medals. Wilma Rudolph was an intensive care child who became a champion because she had all of that support along the way. And she wrote in her memoirs that, I'm paraphrasing, but every champion has to have help to get, where they are. Let's not leave out the men. Albert Einstein, the greatest thinker to ever probably inhabit this earth, never learned his 5th grade math tables. Winston Churchill and FDR saved the world from fascism. Winston Churchill never read beyond a 3rd grade level. Richard Branson, self-made billionaire, has to have his reports read to him. The man can't read. People have helped them along the way. Okay, I'm going to go back to our through line. Now I'm going to talk about effective discipline. Some of this won't, of course, be new to you, but I'm hoping as I review some things, there's something that catches your attention and you think that maybe you could do a little better with that. Because I think we also recognize that many of our intensive care kids are in the principal's office more than other kids. And so they're more impacted by the school discipline. What I'd like you to do right now is maybe I think we could stand up for about 2 minutes. talk to somebody next to you, and what is the goal that all school and classroom discipline should be filling? So if everybody could stand up and just talk for a couple minutes, what's the role, what's the goal of our discipline? Okay, about another 15 seconds. Okay, if I could have you sit, please. If we had a larger or smaller setting, we could have more in-depth discussions, but we can't. I'm gonna presume that some of you talked about some of the things I'm gonna put up on the board right now. First goal of discipline, we are leaders in our schools, and we know that good instruction requires a maintenance of order in the classroom. That teachers that do a good job with order, expectations, follow through, quiet discipline are going to do a better job with academic goals. So that's an essential thing. I was an elementary principal, but I always salute the high school and middle school principals because maintenance of order is such a critical issue in your buildings. You can have a fight in the halls that becomes a gang fight in 10 minutes if you don't have good systems in place. So I give you all the credit for that and the challenges of your job. But I think sometimes we forget that a major goal of discipline is to teach pro-social skills. All of a sudden, we need to remember that you as administrators and as leaders, you are teachers first. And there's a tendency sometimes in our discipline interactions to forget that that child in our office is going to be a child that we are going to teach. And of course, many times when they come into our offices, the misbehavior that has occurred is the result of a poor social skill. And so our job is to teach. And that's where counselors come in. I think some of you are scratching your head and saying, I can't be teaching this kid how to deal with conflict in my office in the 15 minutes I have to deal with them. But I think the handoff between principals and counselors on disciplinary issues is crucial. Third thing is the development of internal locus of control. Sometimes that's called inner discipline. Sometimes it's called self-managed, self-regulation. And I think probably some of you are thinking, oh, wait a minute, that's our SEL curriculum. And I salute the counseling department and the entire district for enhancing the SEL curriculum. And I understand a big grant was just won in that area, and I think that's wonderful news. But I want to make a real strong point on that. SEL is not something that happens on Thursday in the 5th grade classroom when the teacher, the counselor, teaches a lesson. SEL is something that has to be pervasive throughout your entire school. And it starts in the principal's office. Are you able to manage yourself enough to deal with some of these very angry discipline situations in a mindful way? I got to tell you, I don't think there are any of us that do that 100% of the time. I remember that I had my meltdowns. I guess that's a key word lately. But I've had a few meltdowns. But we have to always be looking at our modeling. Are we modeling good management skills, self-management skills to our students? Because one thing we need to remember, Modeling is not the only way kids learn, but it is by far the easiest way. The next question is, are we helping kids to leave our office reflecting about their behavior? Have we succeeded in getting them to think about themselves and their behavior? Because that's kind of, when that's happening, we're teaching self-management. That's a major theme of this presentation, and I will always remember this. The discipline comes from the word disciple. And I think we all know that disciple means learning and teaching. And I want you to think about that in your discipline interactions next week, the following week. Have I been a teacher in my office with this kid? Have I added value to their life? How do you know when kids are learning interdiscipline? It's kind of simple. When they leave your office, are they sitting there saying, Mr. Whitener, he assigned me to Saturday school. I hate that man. And some will say that. Or will they leave your office saying, damn, I was in that football game and we were having an argument. I should have settled it in another way. When you begin to see that behavior with your students, you are doing a good job. When they are always mad at you, and sometimes they will be, but when there's a pattern, maybe you could do a little more teaching. What is responsible behavior? Defined in many books, but I tend to think of responsible behavior. I like William Glasser's approach to that. It's just simply kids behaving in a way where they can meet their needs without interfering with the needs of others or the ability of others to meet their needs. Pretty basic, pretty simple, and it always worked for me. Now, I think we all know that expectations are a big part of discipline. Are they clear? Are they reasonable? Are they posted? Are you teaching them? Are you practicing them? Are you enforcing them? And I walk through some schools now and I'll see the signs, the expectations in the hall and whatever, and I know that there's been a lot of work behind that effort, and I appreciate it. And I think that's a good part of proactive discipline. The other part of expectations that I think is important is, was the expectation reasonable for the child? When we go back and look at, for example, kids with disabilities, let me give you an example of a hyperactive child. We know that to ask them to sit in their chair at the same time as the other kids and to do everything exactly as the other kids, it ain't going to happen. And so we have to make sure our expectations are reasonable expectations. The next thing is, and this is kind of an interesting thing, when people used to walk into my office with a discipline problem, I had two themes that I immediately tried to use as I talked to the kids. Was this an issue of competency, or was it an issue of compliance? And if I decided in my discussions that it was an issue of competency, I had work to do. The counselor had work to do. The social worker had to do. The teacher had work to do. If it was an issue of compliance, then we took another strategy. But that was a simple rule for me to just have those two themes in my mind circulating as I talk to kids. And I should probably tell you a story right now, probably one that you've never had happen in your office. But I had a fifth grader who was cornered in his classroom for not doing his homework, rather publicly, and he turned around and called the teacher a bitch. Have any of you ever had that happen? Never? No? No? Of course, I think the time between that kid and the teacher getting to my office was probably a world record. And they came into my office. I listened to the teacher's story. I listened to the student's story. I suspended the student, called his dad. His dad came in at 11 o'clock in the morning and he smelled of alcohol. After I had explained that he was taking his kid home and what had happened, he looked at me and said, "You're an effing idiot." I'm sure none of you have ever had that happen. Never. So the kid and the dad, they left the office. The dad was very angry. The kid had a rather smug look on his face. I think the teacher felt justice had been done. I sat back in my chair after everybody had left, and I felt like an effing idiot. I think, and why did I feel like an idiot? Because I felt this issue was a competency issue. When I saw that kid's dad and how he handled the situation, I knew that this kid had no idea how to handle criticism. And there I was sending him home. He was going to lose a day of instruction when it was a competency issue. Now, I think the important point of that story was that when that kid came back to school, guess what we were working on? We were working on how to accept criticism. And when I say we, I'm talking about the counselor. We didn't have social workers in that day, and I just applaud the district so much for having social workers. Obviously, this was a case where you would want a social worker to be working also with the family. It's a case where you're counselors and they have to assume this role. A system's the role. This is not the situation where the counselor just talks to the kid. This is the situation where the counselor helps build a team, hopefully including the parent, but that doesn't stop us if we can't get the parent. The teacher, all of us working on this kid's ability to handle criticism. One other area in that thing that I want to move back to kind of the high school level. If you're a 9th grade algebra teacher and you're about to teach a unit on balancing equations, if you're a really good teacher, you're going to do an assessment of the skills these kids have going into that algebra equation balancing. Do they understand negative numbers? Because if they don't understand negative numbers, they can't balance equations. So, but we don't do that sometimes with behavior. And I'm not advocating that you go out and do a whole school-wide assessment on the ability to accept criticism. But what I am saying is we need to evaluate kids, each kid at a time. And I think that's an important part of behavior. Ross Green, if you're dealing with some explosive children, wrote an excellent book called The Explosive Child. And he basically said, children do what they can do. Pretty simple quote, but pretty powerful. I also, at this point, want to refer back to Madeline Hunter, where some of you in this room may not have heard of her very much. And many of you were raised with Madeline Hunter. In my generation, she was the Robert Marzano of our field. She was a researcher at UCLA. Bottom line, Madeline Hunter, and I don't know how she did this research, but I'm going to say it probably was pretty valid. Madeline Hunter said for a child to unlearn an inappropriate behavior and to learn an appropriate behavior, it takes 28 practice sessions or examples or incidences. We give up on these kids oftentimes when we're trying to teach them competency. We give up on them a little too early, and I just remind you that that's an important concept. We have to be patient. Okay, discipline strategies that work. I'm going to go into them very quickly, but when I interview a child, my primary focus, and there's been misbehavior, as I think most of you, is it's justice, it's fairness. I'm the judge. I don't always want to be the judge, but I need to be fair. And so I'm going to listen to both sides, and I'm going to try to be fair. But I try to do something else, and even though maybe this is my psychologist roots, I think it's something that every administrator should have as a part of their portfolio, and that is I'm interviewing to assess the kid. What is his or her depth of emotions about this problem? What is her thinking? What is the context? Because that interview is now going to lead to the interventions. And I need to carefully listen to the children. Meaningful logical consequences. I truly believe if you're going to teach interdiscipline, you have consequences that are related to the kid's behavior. And because I think that logic then allows them to leave your office thinking about their behavior directly related to the consequence and not thinking about you, the administrator, the punisher. However, I think sometimes we fail in that term meaningful. And I have my own definition of meaningful. I believe it should be logical, but I also believe the kids should have a sacrifice. Let me give you an example. At Lemon Valley, my first year as a principal, I did not like suspension. I was a big advocate of Saturday school. I really started it in our area. And my first Saturday school as a new principal, I had 4 third graders come to the Saturday school. They had been in a fight, and we talked for about, and their parents, by the way, were happy to bring them on Saturday. They had a fight. We talked about the fight for about 15 minutes, how they could have prevented it, what they'll do next time. And then we painted the modular out in Lemon Valley for 2 hours and 45 minutes. And this is a really good intervention. It was meaningful. And as the kids are leaving, one of the little third graders grabs my pants and says, "Mr. W, what do I have to do to come back next Saturday?" I went home. Saturday school changed. The next Saturday school was at 1 hour of sitting, 1 hour of reading, and 1 hour of talking and writing about what they can do next time. The consequences, they truly have to be meaningful. I also remember when I talked about my 5th grader who I suspended, and I told you he left the office with a smug look on his face. I don't think it was meaningful. I think he anticipated a day of video games at home while his dad drank. And I just don't think it was meaningful in that situation. I would tell you on my community service at Lemon Valley, which stopped, I'm not sure if community service at the high school level would have a different effect. Because when you ask a high school student to wake up at on a Saturday at 9 o'clock, that's their sleep time. That is meaningful. That's 3 hours away from Snapchat. I think something that may not be meaningful for a 3rd grader may be very meaningful for a high school student. Paul talked about restorative justice, and I think that's been done in schools, but again, I applaud all of you for moving more into that area. It sounds like there's some legislation in that area. I think restorative justice goes back to your mission statement. One part of the Washoe County mission statement is helping students to develop civic responsibility. And I think we all know in very effective classrooms, the teachers build community in their classroom, and the principals and their entire staff build community in the school. But on restorative justice, I think basically what it means is if 2 kids have a fight and there's consequences and there's teaching, those 2 kids still have to be a part of their classroom the next day. And so restorative justice is basically dealing with the misbehavior, and if there's a victim, usually some type of restitution, and of course the starting point is an apology. And that's a strong starting point. Done in a very sincere way, apologies are very impactful. Usually I did a little more than that. I did restitution, that the victim or the perpetrator had to do something for the victim. One caveat to that, I think the bully research is saying that's not a good idea in bullying situations. When you have a bully situation, many times the victims feel intimidated by the bully, and putting them together to an apology just doesn't work. At Peavine, I had 4 third graders who, to my surprise, were yelling racial slurs at an Asian neighbor next door who was painting her fence. And I had to overcome my anger. I was raised in Berkeley. I'm kind of a liberal. And racial slurs, you don't have to be a liberal to be offended by that, but I was greatly offended. But I took a walk. I calmed myself down, called their parents, and said, I would like your boys, and I also called the neighbor, I would like your boys to be painting the neighbor's fence to help her finish it after school. 3 of the parents said, great. 1 said no. And so we worked out an alternative plan for him. The boys went out. They did a very sincere apology, which we had practiced to the lady, and all 5 of us painted the fence for an hour or 2. And at the end of the day, she brought out the most delectable Chinese cookies I've ever eaten. And when that day was over, I really kind of thought that I had helped. That was restorative justice in terms of the international community. I felt I had helped these kids learn a lesson and better fit into our international community. The Conference for Learning I'm going to get into in just a minute, but don't ever forget that the conference, when you have a discipline situation, is usually the most important part of your discipline intervention. Do not succumb to the idea that maintenance of order is the most important. It is primary, it is very important, but the conference is usually where the learning goes on. And then, of course, when the kids leave, you should have a plan for success. Sometimes kids need to be separated, different area of the lunchroom, da-da-da-da. In high school, I'm sure it's kind of maybe changing schedules. One thing about the discipline conference, and again, I think our intensive care children are in these conferences many times more than the average children, so they really need to learn in these conferences. If you jump out of an airplane with a parachute on your back, but it never opens, it doesn't work. And if our goal in all discipline interactions is teaching and learning, the kids' parachute to learning has to be open. They have to be open to learning. And I also recognize that one of the greatest times to teach kids is not during that SEL curriculum lesson, which are important. It's during the emotion of misbehavior. Think about that yourselves right now. You probably can remember times when you were in trouble in school better than many other things. Your emotions were involved. So now we have this great opportunity to teach kids. Empathy goes a mile. As Kim said when students were grieving, a little empathy is powerful. That doesn't mean you have to be counselors and psychologists. It means an occasional statement like, man, you guys, you must have been really angry when that kid called you a name. Just a kind statement, because it reaches out to the kid and says, I'm connecting with you. I want to know. I want to know your story. Listening. Are we doing a good job listening? We have 5 things on our plate to do. But this little kid, or in high school, this big kid, they are very seriously involved. Are we going to take the time to listen? And sometimes we listen, but there's more to listening. It's telling that student you're listening. One of my techniques was pretty simple. Now, let me see if I've got this. You did this and I did that. That's telling the kid, I want to know. I want to know your story. Tell me your story. Stress reduction. The psychologists in this room will tell you in no uncertain terms that the research on stress has shown that all of us react to stress in different ways. And what we have to be very careful that kids can have some stress because they're in trouble, but if we overdo it, if we're in their face, that could be the end of all learning for some kids. And we need to know that. Vince Lombardi, great football coach, always said, praise in public, criticize in private. And he was a master of stress. He wanted those, I guess in those days, 250-pounders. He wanted them a little stressed, but he was not about to go out and publicly stress them. I really like that concept. Differentiated learning and discipline. We ask our teachers to teach kids in a differentiated way. One kid's going to learn fractions this way. That same kid, the kid next to him, needs to have it more hands-on. We need to be aware of that as teachers in our offices dealing with discipline interactions. I had a second grade teacher who I was observing one day, and I had the opportunity to observe her dealing with two boys that had called a girl fatso. She took the one boy aside, and she knew he was developmentally kind of delayed in the class, and she said, "Who's your favorite hero?" And he said, "Spider-Man." And then she said, "Would Spider-Man ever call somebody fatso?" Well, I thought she would use the same approach with the other kid involved, but again, he was a little more cognitively developed than the first one, and when she talked to him, she said, "Can you imagine if you were fat and somebody called you fatso? How would you feel?" Man, I learned a lot from that lady that day, and I always have tried in my office to respect the needs of the kids in my office and their learning styles. I also, and this is debatable, some of you could spend an afternoon debating this, I also believed in differentiated discipline. Look at our court system. Individuals that have done similar crimes many times have different consequences from judges. The judges look at their history, their drug use, their family situation, and they will sometimes do different penalties. My thinking was on this, and I know we could debate this, my thinking was I tried to have proportionate consequences that were logical, but not always the same. For example, that kid who left my office after calling the teacher a bad name, if he did that again, I probably would have done in-school suspension. Maybe if the average kid got 1 day of suspension at home, I might have done 1.5 days with him in school. That's differentiated discipline. Planning and practicing, again, when we teach these kids, for example, if we're doing conflict management skills, we can't just intellectualize with them. We have to role play, and I know as administrators we can't always do that. That's where that handoff to the counselor becomes so critical. This slide is too complicated or too much on it, but I'm going to just jump into school suspension right now. I recognize if it's in board policy, you need to do it. In my day, there were some things where it was part of board policy, you got to follow that. I also recognize, having worked with high school principals, that when you have a fight in your building, you need to get those kids out of the building, and there is no substitute for sending them home on a suspension. I also recognized when kids came in my office, when I had district discipline as one of my hats, that the guidance suspension was not always a bad idea. Sometimes kids were having so many problems, they needed to get out of the building for a day or two, come to the district office, we would reorganize, look at resources, and bring them back in. I recognize that was a feature we needed to do. And I think the district, to the credit of everybody in this room, has expanded those types of services. where we have district AIT teams now and district MTSS teams. However, on your more common discipline problems, I'm not a big fan of suspension. If we really believe that instruction matters, why are we sending them home? I also, now, I would tell you one case where suspension worked when I was in Alaska. We had a foster home near our school, and they had some very delinquent kids, and they would come to our school, and they would misbehave, and they'd be sent home. But at this foster home, they had all their wood piles outside of the house. And when they came home on suspension, it was 6 hours of splitting wood. And you know what? It worked. But who was in control of that intervention? It was the parents. And I don't know if we want to turn over the power of the intervention to parents when in many homes today, when they come home, a bad day playing video games is better than a good day at school. And so I'm not a fan of suspension. I think there are many alternatives to suspension, but I don't think I think Saturday school is just one. I always liked that concept for a number of reasons. One, we added instruction. As I told you, when we did it at Lemon Valley, we had an hour of reading and an hour of writing. I also found that when the kids came in on Saturday, it was easier to talk with them. We had some great learning sessions. I also remember in our area that we teamed together in the North Valley. So we had 6 schools doing Saturday school, and all of the principals only had to come in one Saturday. So if you were at Stead and you were in a fight and you were assigned to Saturday school, you could come to my school on my particular day. One last comment about suspension, which I think we have to all be careful of, and that is that national statistics are saying there's a disproportion amongst races in suspension, and that is a major red flag, and it's being looked at nationally, and I'm going to presume it's being looked at locally. Special education has a lot of regulations, and one regulation they have is that when a kid is having serious discipline problems that are interfering with his education, or he's being suspended a lot, the law requires us to do an assessment and to develop a positive behavior program. The law, the special ed law, requires a teaching approach to misbehavior. I'm going to do a little salute to a friend or a great person that died this week, Elijah Cummings, and my salute is, come on, man! If we're doing that for special ed, why aren't we doing it for other kids? And I think many of you are. But I just want to leave that with you. We probably need to kind of follow the lead of special ed, and that is we need to teach these kids new behaviors. I don't think I need to go through the PTR in great depth, but I like the PTR way of thinking, and it's pretty simple. What is the primary misbehavior, and what is the function of that behavior? What's behind it? What would be a more appropriate behavior? How are we going to, what do we want this kid to do? Most of us are very skilled at saying what we don't want them to do. Not always are we skilled at saying what we want them to do. How will we teach the new behavior? How will we reinforce it? I remember a kid at Moss who was the big bully on the playground and always resolved his conflicts with force. We had a counselor at Moss working with that kid on conflict management skills, and the poor kid, the first day that he demonstrated those skills on a tetherball feud, the duty teacher told the teacher called him in and complimented him, teacher told the counselor brought him in and they role-played what he had done, and then a call went home. That's what I mean about a team working together. How will we change the child's environment? How are we going to prevent the misbehavior? And lastly, is there a referral to district resources or community resources that are needed? We need to use that PTR thinking more often with our kids with disabilities, but our kids without disabilities. It works. And that's why I think maybe translating into a different language, we need to have more MTSS behavioral meetings, I think. Function and misbehavior, we talked about looking behind the behavior, and I hope all of us are doing that when we have misbehavior. The first concern is competency. Are these kids competent to do what we're asking them to do? The function of behavior that I fall back on the most is the basic needs of a child. I had a situation at Peavine that I'll never forget, the greatest story in my 45 years of education. I'm in my office on the first day of school, and these two little second graders bring down $20 bills and say, "Mr. Whitener, we were giving these $20 bills on the playground." And I'm going, well, kids, money, it happens about once a year in our elementary school. I sent somebody out there. About 20 minutes later, two sixth graders came in, and they had both been gifted $100. So I'm thinking, I think I need to go out there and get my gift. But then I pulled back and I said, wait a minute, I'm the principal. Long story short, we had a kid with special needs who handed out $2,000 on our playground that day. No wonder schools like Elmcrest were asking parents for variances, or their parents were asking for variances to go to Peavine because they wanted their share of the money. Anyway, special needs child had found $2,000 in his mother's freezer, handing him out. And what was behind that? After everything had been settled down, I sat back in my chair and I said, how do I discipline in this situation? Bottom line, the kid was trying to buy friends. So he was dealing with a need. And of course we dealt with it through our counselor, through the special ed process. We put friendship skills in his IEP, and we went from there. But that's an example of how you really, again, do not succumb to the fact that we're just trying to maintain order. We need to look behind the behavior. Deep-rooted emotions, that's something that we see a lot, and sometimes we have to just listen, figure out those emotions, give the kids another behavior which will help them with their anger. Many times the counselors will try guidance, but they also realize they're not therapists, so this may be an outside referral type thing. Faulty perceptions. We see that a lot. Kid who's not very good in school decides that if I'm going to be important at this school, I'll be the biggest, toughest bully on the playground. And that's a type of thinking that can be targeted and it can be changed. Lastly, again, I think my fifth grader that was suspended went home thinking that wasn't such a bad thing. I think he was rewarded for his behavior. I don't think that suspension was going to change anything. We need to look at, well, kid in algebra class in high school who's kicked out of class. Bottom line is that kid may want to be out of class and he gets reward for being kicked out. Okay. What I want right now is I want to move quickly to care and support. And I'm going to skip this section because I need to move a little faster. But in terms of support system, an IC kid is in a teacher's class. Is that teacher alone in terms of their support for that kid? Some of the best elementary schools I've been in is where the grade level teachers work together to support a child. They're there when there's a substitute. Many of you at the high school level have your systems of teams, but we need to always, as a good functioning school, we need to look at these kids as our kids and not Mrs. Smith's kid. We'll skip this. Okay, when we look at extra care, I like to start off with this quote: every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. We need to understand that these kids may have called us names, they may have been disrespectful to us, but we have to find a way to forgive them and work with them and have hope for them. And we need to help our teachers get to that attitude. If you don't have that attitude and believing in these kids that they can find a bloom someday, we're not going to reach those kids. We have to understand that change takes time, and we have to understand, going back to Madeline Hunter, that it may take 28 times before we're going to see new behaviors. We can never give up on these kids. And lastly, the other team is always recruiting. If our intensive care kids are not successful in our buildings, guess who's recruiting? Crime, gangs. It's a big battle out there, and I think we have to pay attention to that. This slide originally said relationships trump substance. For political reasons, I changed the word. But I got to tell you a story. When I was a kid, my favorite, or the character my mother read to me more than anyone was Bambi. And in the story of Bambi, there's a rabbit called Thumper. And Thumper had the greatest quote, better than John F. Kennedy's, better than Ronald Reagan's. And his quote was, "If you can't say something nice, don't say nothing at all." Probably would be relevant for today's politics. But where am I talking about on that slide? Your relationship with these kids that you're seeing more and more in your office is so important. I like that quote. I've learned that people will forget what you say and people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Do you buy a car from a used salesman who disrespects you? We need to make sure that we maintain a respectful relationship with these kids. I really like the concept of the emotional bank account. This is from Stephen Covey in The 7 Habits. He basically says that when we make little deposits into these kids' savings, little deposits like checking in with them, checking on how they're doing, going to their games, apologizing, keeping commitments, that when we do that, we're building up a savings account that when we need to confront them, we have that savings account. Alan Holmes at Peavine this summer when I went by Peavine was coming back from going out to the apartments, the Section 8 apartments. He had been reading to students out there in the summer. And I'm thinking to myself, this is a perfect example of emotional bank account. He's making a deposit not only for those kids, but for their parents when they need to come in and work with the school. When I was at Lemon Valley, I took some of my most challenging renegades to UNR basketball games. And my wife and I did that together. I'm not saying you have to do those type things, but little check-ins, little motions of care go a long way. I want you to think about the concept of the bloom of these child. I go back to a quote from Benjamin Franklin. Many of these kids may be a sundial in the shade. If we could just move them to the sun and let them use their strengths and let them use their voice, that may be the most important thing we can do to help them become successful IC students who have become their own caretakers. There is no substitute for encouragement. We need to focus on their abilities and not their disabilities. We need to focus on what they're good at and not all of their misbehavior. What I'd like you to do right now, and I'll just take a minute and then I'm going to conclude with a story. I'd like you to look at these 4 areas of things that you can do to help your IC students become their own caretakers. And decide which of the 4 are you doing really well, and which of the 4 could you do a better job of. So could you stand up and for about 1 minute share with one another, what are you strong at and what could you do a better job? Please stand up. What? Okay, please have a seat. I know I didn't give you much time. I think we're going to be moving pretty quickly. Have a seat. Okay, I'm going to start right now telling you a story. This is a true story. Some of you will know the individual I'm going to talk about. And I haven't changed any names. This is the story of an IC child in Reno who became a champion. When I was a school psychologist, I went out to Silver Lake School to evaluate a 2nd grader. I went into the classroom not knowing which student it was, and I immediately knew who this student was. His desk was piled with papers, he was drawing, and the teacher was, in the meantime, teaching capital letters. I knew that I needed to talk to David. I brought him into a conference room and we talked, and I could see this kid was brilliant. I could have talked to him all day, but school psychologists can't do that. After a while, we did our evaluation, and I came up with the fact, and I asked him to write 4 paragraphs, or 4 sentences about 2nd grade. He wrote 4 sentences. I could not understand 1 word, but he could tell me just a treatise about what it was to be a 2nd grader. David was a very unique individual who struggled in school throughout. Many times teachers were frustrated with him because he was drawing in the back of the room while they were teaching. When he reached middle school at O'Brien, he wasn't a big behavior problem. He was a big behavior problem to himself. He was hitting walls. He had to go home. And when I've talked to David's parents, they said their champion in schools was not a teacher, but the principal at O'Brien, Michelle Collins. Michelle worked with David, told the parents, no, you can't send him out on homebound. Let's keep him here a half day. In the meantime, his parents got an art teacher because they could see that his sketching was the bloom. David went on and went through the school system and graduated from Hug High School. When he was a junior, 9/11 occurred. And like many juniors at that time, or many students, he enlisted in the Army a couple years later. This little guy who couldn't write a sentence and was kind of unique in the schools, didn't have a lot of friends, and was always sketching, joined the Special Forces. And David was sent to Afghanistan, and David was assigned one day to drop from an airplane with his group. They were to land in the Afghanistan countryside at midnight, and they walked all night to a Taliban fortress. And their job, they were doing reconnaissance for an international force that was about to invade that fortress. David was sending back pictures of the landscape. David was killed that day. When David, he his drawing, his bloom, had helped him to become a champion. David was greeted as a hero in Reno. The governor came to his funeral. His family was also honored in Scotland by Prince Harry, because it was the British forces that were invading that fortress. David had found his bloom. He had become his own caretaker, and he died as a very proud champion. Thank you very much.